I don't know what compelled me to finally share this, but I have been thinking about it a lot the past few days, and I thought it fit this sub relatively well. I'm one of those long-time lurkers who has been sitting on their own story for ages, but I finally got around to writing my experience down, and I hope someone out there finds this interesting to read. Apologies in advance for the length. I have a lot of thoughts about this, as it was my first and only time I felt legitimately afraid for my life. When I was about 8 years old, my parents were going through a divorce, and me and my older sister used to spend a lot of time at our grandparents' house. It's a long ranch-style home in a very nice neighborhood that's a 10-minute walk from a gas station, grocery store, and a few fast food restaurants. The streets are long and lined with well-manicured houses, cradled by big, scenic California valley hills all around. We were never very wealthy, but my grandpa bought it as a fixer-upper many years ago, and the property value has skyrocketed since then. As you can imagine, it's a very safe spot, and although there weren't many other kids in the neighborhood, it wasn't uncommon to see neighbors walking their dogs or pushing a stroller down the sidewalk outside of our house. Although my mom was especially protective all of our lives, this particular neighborhood was densely populated, and my family knew just about everyone who lived there. She grew up in that neighborhood herself, so she was understandably trusting. She would once in a while let me and my sister walk to the Rotten Robbie's gas station on the other end of the block to grab a snack. I would always get a ring pop, and my sister would grab a Three Musketeers before we made our way back home. My sister was about 11 at the time, and this small amount of freedom was a really big deal to us. Nothing compared to walking down that street all by ourselves in the summertime, laughing and joking around, a couple dollar bills in our pockets. I felt like I owned the world. The one oddity I never noticed around the neighborhood was a small camper parked on the side of the road opposite to the gas station, right along the back side of the fence of another house. It sat there in the shade like a permanent fixture, all the windows constantly covered by opaque beige curtains. I can't explain why, but it always gave me this deep sense of foreboding when I'd pass it. I was almost positive someone was living inside of it, because at times I'd hear the air conditioner running as it sat stagnant in that same spot. The hairs on my neck would always stand on end as I passed it, particularly as I passed the camper door, and I'd always keep an eye on it for the fear that one day it'd swing open just as I came to pass by. I think what bothered me the most was a drawing taped to the door from the inside. It was extremely messy, a sketch of odd lines in a brown-colored pencil that was frustratingly indiscernible. I could see the outline of something, a vague shape, but could never make out what it was intended to be. I never had the nerves to stop and stare long enough to really investigate, but each time I walked by, I'd steal a glance. A year prior to the incident I'm about to describe, I was walking with my mom past the camper in the shade. We had just gone to the park nearby, and unfortunately had to pass the camper before we could cross the street and continue walking. I didn't want to seem afraid, so I kept on walking right behind her, and I didn't object when she walked past it. This time, I felt a little more brave. I was frustrated not being able to decipher the drawing for so long, and, while my mom was feet away, I stopped in front of the camper door and took a moment to really look at the drawing. Upon closer inspection, the paper was filthy. I remember doing a project in elementary school where we soaked the printer paper in black coffee to make it look aged, and that's what it reminded me of. My mom walked on without noticing I'd stopped following her, but my eyes stayed fixed on that indistinct mass of dirt-caked scribbles until I could make out what looked to be a tiny, malformed face. My stomach turned. I immediately felt cold and disgusted as my eyes trailed over the rest of the image. I didn't know what kind of creature it was at the time, but now I can look back and say the drawing was a badly deformed fetus inside a mass of large, perfect circles, like those made by a circular ring ruler. Its face was contorted, as if in pain. It was so graphically disturbing and seemed to portray this odd sense of suffering that stuck with me for days. As a child, I didn't know how to process it, and the mental image still makes me sick to think about. I'd never seen anything like it before. Adrenaline flooded my body, and my chest hurt with fear. But I selfishly thought of my glorious little trips for ring pops and said absolutely nothing as I followed behind my mom. This was, in retrospect, a classically terrible idea. It's one of those things you scream at main characters in movies for. Ever since my ill feeling towards the camper had been elevated by the drawing on the door, I thought about it every time we drove by, and about a month later, my mom once again graced us with several bucks and permission to walk down to Rotten Robbie and grab our respective snacks. I thought about telling my sister what I'd seen on the way there, but she was older and braver, and I was terrified that she'd make me cross the street with her to check it out. It was a bright sunny day, and I told myself with false certainty that nothing was going to happen. If I didn't acknowledge it, maybe it'd go away. We walked past the camper, and it was thankfully uneventful. On the walk back, I was feeling more comfortable and was focused on fighting open my candy wrapper while my sister walked alongside me. We passed the camper a second time, but I didn't give half as much thought as the first time. I don't remember what we were talking about, but I recall being interrupted mid-sentence as my sister softly yet firmly said my name. There was a distinct fear in her voice that immediately set me on edge like a bucket of ice water. All my senses heightened, and I became aware of everything, including the sound of haphazard footsteps about 10 feet behind us. It was accompanied by a heavy rustling sound, like a heavy backpack, and nervously, I half turned my head to look. A man with a long, unkempt beard and wearing many layers of ragged clothing stood behind us, eyes unmistakably burning into our backs as he walked. His movements weren't normal. It was a drunken shuffle, like each of his feet were unimaginably heavy and needed to be moved one grand effort at a time. His shoulders were skewed, head tilted downward, with a strange arch of his neck. I could hear his shoes scraping on the gravel with every step, but rather than seeming genuinely intoxicated, it was as if he was intentionally meandering our direction, like a zombie with a direct effort to frighten us. Behind him, I saw the camper door was wide open for the first time in all the years we'd spent living there, and realized this was the man who had been living inside. "He's following us," I choked out, my eyes filling with tears. My mind was spinning as I stared straight ahead again, the wide street and sidewalks abnormally empty all around. My sister grabbed my hand. She squeezed it hard enough to hurt without looking my way, speaking carefully under her breath. "On the count of 3, we race home," she told me in a very serious tone of voice. I couldn't reply through the growing lump in my throat, but every single cell in my body understood that we had to put some distance between us and this man as quickly as possible. She began to count steadily while we walked faster, and the most terrifying part is that he started running before we even had a chance to. He must have heard her directions to me and tried to get a head start by sprinting our direction before she got to 3. But his footsteps were noisy, and we bolted like deer the instant we heard him behind us. I'll never forget it. The chase felt exactly like you imagine in your nightmares. The fear your pursuer is inches away from grabbing your arm or fistful of your hair. I picture myself being dragged into the van with nobody around to see or hear me. We ran so fast we didn't even have the breath to scream, and peering back behind me about 10 seconds later, I saw him running our direction with absolutely none of the impairment he showed with those zombie-like steps moments before. I think back on it now, and he may have been deliberately pretending to be handicapped to lower our guard so we wouldn't start running. The thought is terrifying, but I can't rationalize it any other way. We made it to our grandparents' house and, without looking behind us, yanked open the stubborn old door before slamming it closed and scrambling past their excited dogs to get as deep in the house as possible. I don't even think we locked it, as our main goal was getting within the line of sight of any adults as quickly as possible. My mom was talking to my grandma at the table and gave us an amused look when we bounded into the living room. Since we were kids, running around wasn't anything out of the ordinary, and she didn't ask what happened as we collapsed on the couch and tried to catch our breath. The inside of the house felt so safe and felt in such good spirits that I didn't even want to bring up what just happened. Like waking up from a nightmare you didn't want to talk about, I was so desperate to go back to normalcy. I wanted to forget it entirely, to unwrap my candy and act like everything was completely normal for the sake of my own sanity. And that's exactly what I did. I asked my sister a few years back if she remembered this incident. I'm 25 and she's 28 now, and her response was strange. She remembered immediately without the need for me to provide details, but she quickly waved it off and insisted that he had to have been a bored homeless man looking to spook some kids walking home with no real intent to harm anyone. I don't know. I'd like to believe it's some innocent misunderstanding, but like they always say about gut feelings, they're rarely wrong. I feel in my soul that he wanted to hurt me and my sister that day. I never told her or anyone else about the strange drawing on the door, and I'm not sure if my sister saw the door open and connected him to the camper or not. It's one of my biggest regrets, as I would hate for any other children to be less fortunate after innocently walking past the camper in the shade. I believe he may have chosen that spot between the park and gas station deliberately due to the number of children walking around the area. I never saw the camper again a day or so after this. I'm not proud of how I handled this, and I would encourage anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation to contact the authorities immediately for the safety of others around. I don't know if maybe this whole story comes off as melodramatic, but it was very real and very frightening in a way I can't forget. So, possibly deranged camper guy by the gas station, whatever your intent was, let's not meet. Back when we moved into our house, we were introduced to all of our neighbors by them coming to our house with cookies or brownies, like they do in movies. This was a nice, quiet, middle-class neighborhood, made up of mostly older white people and new families. I mention that because we were the only black family in the neighborhood. No black wives, husbands, not even adopted children. We didn't find it strange, though. It was just very clear that we were different. I was about 13 at the time, and my brother was 15. Our backyard is half an acre and is fenced, but it's connected to 2 other houses' backyards. Each one is half the size of ours, but we all have separating fences. So to picture it, there's a T-shaped fence separating our backyards. The house to the left was the home of an older man named Tom. He reminded me of Willie Nelson without the cool pigtails. He liked to be outside shirtless, usually with a denim vest, no matter the weather. He was a well-built man, but visibly kind of frail. We actually found him funny in a creepy old guy type of way. As I got older, he started to make comments. I played in the backyard with my 2 dogs a lot, and Tom could see me from his living room window that faced his backyard. Whenever I glanced over, I would see him in the window, just standing there, watching me. When he noticed that I saw him, he'd come out and talk to me. I tried to get away before he could come out, but sometimes I was too slow. I didn't want to make it too obvious, so I would just walk, but if I didn't make it inside, he'd yell for me to come back. I never got too close to the fence. I'd speak from a distance. He'd ask me about school, what grade I was in, tell me I was pretty, ask if I was old enough to have a boyfriend, and if I had an older sister or older friends that looked like me. I'd laugh it off, but after a few questions, he'd stop talking and just stare at me silently. I'd always give an excuse about needing to go inside. He'd nod and stand at the fence and watch me walk back into the house. This happened almost weekly. My mom loves to decorate, so she changes the house decor every few months. Pretty annoying, actually. In one of her designing sprees, she decided to get a new sliding glass door for the back porch, which required her to take the curtains down in the living room. It took forever to get them installed, but she figured there was no point in putting the curtains back up if we just had to take them down again. Fine. Our family TV was in the living room. I didn't have a TV in my room, so I'd often watch TV late into the night in the living room with my brother. One night, my brother went to bed early, so I decided to watch TV by myself. Around midnight or so, I turned the TV off to go to bed. I got up from the couch, turned off the light, and turned around to see another light on. Not in my house, but in Tom's house, in his living room, and there he was, standing in the window, watching me. I told my parents about it later, and they shrugged it off. As my name suggests, I'm an anxious soul, so I oftentimes chalk things up to my anxiety. Fine. Soon after, my dogs started getting sick. I'd take them out to play, and they'd start throwing up or having diarrhea. We knew it wasn't their food because we hadn't given them anything new. We threw away the dog treats we recently bought, just in case that was the problem, but it didn't stop. I noticed, though, that every time I let them out alone, they'd run straight over to Tom's fence, jumping up and down, wagging their tails. He'd slowly walk outside, reach over the fence, and feed them his treats, which was odd because Tom didn't have a dog. I told my parents, and my dad went to talk to him, telling him the dogs were getting sick. He apologized, stopped feeding them, and they got better. A few weeks later, I was coming home from high school. My brother was in the grade above me, and I was a senior, so he was in college at the time. When I got home, no one else would be home for a few hours. I had a routine. I put my book bag upstairs, changed clothes, let the dogs out of their cages on the porch, get a snack, and then let them back in. For some reason, I was unusually excited to see my dogs that day, so instead of going upstairs, I went straight to the back porch. I got to the door to open it, and I saw Tom sitting on the ground in front of my dog's cages. I froze. He didn't see me. I look over to see if the door was locked. It wasn't. I locked it as slowly as possible so it didn't make noise. It did. He looked over and saw me standing there. I ran upstairs and called my parents. My mom's a nurse, so she didn't have her phone on, and my dad just never answers the phone. I didn't think it was serious enough to call the police, so I just hid. After a moment, I heard him knock on the door. It wasn't loud or aggressive, though. It was almost friendly, like he just wanted to talk. I tried my dad's phone again, he answered. I was crying and telling him Tom was on the porch. He said he'd head home, but he was over an hour away. I just sat in my room waiting for my dad. The knocking stopped. My dad got home and Tom was gone. I don't know what happened between Tom and my dad, but he stopped coming outside and talking to me. He never stopped watching though, always standing in his living room. Sometimes I'd see him through the window and he'd wave at me, but always with the light on, just so I knew he was still there. Over a 2 to 3 year period, I had many encounters with this person. I met him in middle school. We were not really friends, but in the same class. He was also my neighbor, living across the street from me before moving just down the street. The first encounter was in 2015, us both in grade 8. I received a message from him on Facebook. Me not wanting to be impolite, replied. Immediately, the conversation was weird. He was telling me that his girlfriend, who was also the mother of his child, died. I was very confused and suspicious, as like I said, we were in middle school. He then escalated and started talking about taking his own life. I did not take this lightly, since he was quite standoffish in school and I never seen him with a lot of friends. While trying to talk him down, I messaged his sister, who I knew somewhat well, about his threats. She messaged me back shortly, saying that he was okay, and he's been messaging multiple people the same thing. I was in shock. Who would joke about something like that? After that encounter, I stayed clear of him in the neighborhood, and I never replied to any of his other messages. I believe I took him off my Facebook not too long after. I couldn't, however, get too far from him in class. In one of my classes, he sat across the room from me and would just stare at me. It was so intense that the person who sat next to me actually told me that he was staring at me, but every time I turned, he would turn his head away fast. Not too long after that, the encounters got more and more intense. During a class, we were able to work in the cafeteria, so me and a group of girls sat in there, mostly joking around. The room was quite large, with 2 doors on either sides. My friends and I sat at the far left side door. I happened to look up and see the guy at the other door. I told my friends as he made many people uncomfortable. We didn't think much of it and continued to work. Maybe 5 minutes after seeing him, he enters the room and turns off all the lights. Us being 8th graders let out loud screams, probably heard all over the school, and ran to each other. One of the lights turned on, and I turn around, seeing him right behind me. I jumped so far back, I accidentally hit one of the girls, sending her to the ground. The teacher came in, and we told her everything. He was sent right to the principal. Nothing else happened at school until that summer. As I said earlier, he moved just down the street. My friend and I walked all the time to a park that was in that area. The first time walking past his new house, I was with my friend, just about to pass his house. His younger sister yelled his name, saying his friends are walking by. In that moment, we booked it past the house. I think our feet left the ground, we were running so fast. We turned around when we were at a safe enough distance. We saw him at his doorway, grinning, this hair-raising grin. The weird thing was, how does his sister know who we were? She was at least 5 years younger than us. Freaked out, we decided on our way back that we would take a different route. Another night, it was dark. My friend and I were walking back from the park. We realized that we were going to have to walk past this guy's house, since the other route was not safe at night. Walking past his house, we held our breaths and kept our heads down. Just as we were passing his door, we heard a sing-song voice saying my name. and that they see me. I stopped right in my tracks, and I turned to my friend. It was him. Again, we ran, and we didn't stop until we were about 10 houses away from him. Tears were running down my face, because not only did he call me by my name, we also heard a toy gun make shooting noises. For the rest of summer, we never heard or saw him again. He still lived there, but never interacted with us, although I always made sure I would hurry past his house on my walks. We didn't end up going to the same high school, thank God, basically forgetting about him at this point, until my friends and I were about to get off at our bus stop after school. Once we got off, we saw him standing there. Our bus stop was about a 5-minute walk to my house and my friend's house. This time, my other friend was with us as she was coming to my house. Immediately, my other friend, who I wasn't close with, told us that the weirdo has been coming to her house basically every day, asking to hang out. They hung out once, unintentionally, since they were both walking the neighborhood, and her, like me, too polite to ignore him. She said her mother had eventually told him to buzz off. I told her not to walk to her house and just come to mine. The 3 of us headed to my house, and in horror, he followed us. Not directly behind us. He was on the next street that was so close to the street that we were on that we could see him. Unfortunately, he already knew where I lived since he was my neighbor in the past. We could clearly see him stalking us from across the next street, so we were freaking out. We ended up running the rest of the way. Once to my doorstep, we saw that he was walking across his old house lawn towards my house. Like in every horror movie ever, I dropped my keys. My friends yelling in my ear to hurry up, he's getting closer. Finally, I opened the door. We ran to my window, which he could see in clearly, and just stare at him. He was just standing across the street with that same grin he had in the summer. My friend, who had bigger balls than I did, marched outside, yelling that if he didn't leave, she will call the cops. He laughed, walking away, and after that, it was as if he never existed. I never had an encounter after that. I've seen him in my city a couple of times, and every time I would feel my heart sink. He will forever terrify me. I'm in my 3rd year of university now. Those interactions, even years ago, will still give me the shivers. Ironically now, he's a father, so hopefully he left his creepy habits behind.